Adding this to itself as many as 314 times won't surpass pi, but the 315th time would. And remember, unraveling why we're doing all this, that's a way of counting how many jumps on the phase diagram gets us into the end zone, which in turn is a way of counting how many times the blocks collide until they're sailing off never to touch again. So that, my friends, is why a mass ratio of 10,000 gives 314 collisions. Likewise, a mass ratio of 1,000,000 to 1 will give an angle, theta equals the inverse tangent of 1 over 1,000. This is extremely close to 0.001. And again, if we ask about the largest integer multiple of this angle that doesn't surpass pi, it's not as it would be for a precise value of 0.001, namely 3,141. These are the first 4 digits of pi because that is, by definition, what digits of a number mean. This explains why when the mass ratio is 1,000,000, the number of collisions is 3,141. And you might notice that all of this relies on the hope that the inverse tangent of a small value is sufficiently close to the value itself, which is another way of saying that the tangent of a small value is approximately that value itself. Intuitively, there's a really nice reason this is true. If you look at a unit circle, the tangent of any given angle is the height of this little triangle I've drawn divided by its width. And when that angle is really small, the width is basically 1, the radius of your circle, and the height is basically the same as the arc length along that circle. And by definition, that arc length is theta. To be more precise about it, the Taylor series expansion of tangent of theta shows that this approximation will have only a cubic error term. So, for example, the tangent of 1/100th differs from 1/100th itself by something on the order of 1/1,000,000th. So even if we were to consider 314 steps with this angle, the error between the actual value of arctan 100 and the approximation
One of the most common old school player comments that I get is that Yu-Gi-Oh! Died after the introduction of pendulums. If you're one of those people, I hope you really take this video to heart. I'm not necessarily trying to convince anyone to come back into Yu-Gi-Oh! But this is going to be a discussion sort of talking about how pendulums and just in general, anytime someone thinks something is killing Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't always happen nearly on the scale that you think it does. People are very afraid of change. This goes for life, it goes for any game, it goes for any card game, and this is especially true in Yu-Gi-Oh! I've actually made an entire video talking about top 10 times Yu-Gi-Oh! Was dying, sort of making fun of the fact that people are always saying, I mean, for the last like 15 years, that this is going to be a thing that kills Yu-Gi-Oh! No, this is going to be a thing that kills Yu-Gi-Oh! And in today's video, I want to focus entirely on pendulum summoning, which is something that a lot of people complain about, because at this point, synchro summoning, it's 10 years old. A lot of people have sort of given up on complaining about that. There still are comments from people that say, oh, synchro summoning and extra deck mechanics are what ruined Yu-Gi-Oh! But for the most part, synchro summoning is just like an old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Type of thing now, which is crazy to think about. And then Xyz summoning, a lot of people don't really complain about either. For nowadays, it seems like at least my own comment section, the players or the ex-players that are coming on and complaining about modern Yu-Gi-Oh! They're complaining about pendulums and they're complaining about link summoning. Maybe we'll do a video on link summoning eventually, but for now, I want to focus entirely on pendulums. The way I see it, most of the complaints about pendulums stem from one of two areas. The first area, and one that I actually agree with, is that pendulum summoning is overly confusing. This is absolutely true. When pendulum summoning was announced, it looked ridiculous. You now have monsters that are spells. They go face up in the extra deck. They have scales on them. They have 2 different effects. There's so much text on these pendulum cards and so many rulings surrounding them. How does anyone keep track of that? And I actually sympathize with that, because as someone that was around when pendulum summoning was first introduced, yeah, it was pretty confusing and a lot of people had rulings wrong. There was a lot to relearn about Yu-Gi-Oh! The The other area that people are usually coming from is that pendulums were way too strong out of the gate and made other decks unplayable. We're going to address both of those things, starting off with the fact that pendulums are too confusing. So the counterpoint to pendulums being too confusing is two different things. The first thing is that every new mechanic, every new ruling is a little bit too confusing when you first look at it. No one expects you to understand a new mechanic the first day that you read it. Every time that a new mechanic is introduced, there's tons of ruling questions about it for months afterward. Heck, we're still getting questions about link monsters, and they've been out for over a year now, so everyone is confused when a new mechanic gets introduced. It's not really a reason to quit the game over just because you personally don't want to learn it. The other counterpoint to this is that the pendulum zones themselves have actually moved to the back row, the left and rightmost column of your spell and trap card zone, and that makes them a lot easier to understand, because one of the biggest complaints of pendulum summoning was that you had these two new zones on the mats and all the old mats didn't quite work. I completely understand that. I think it was ridiculous that they had new zones. They should have always been in the back row, but at the very least Konami has reversed that ruling with the introduction of link summoning, so pendulums are now found in your spell and trap card zone. That makes it make a lot more sense. And now for the bulk of the video, I want to discuss that second point that a lot of people quit Yu-Gi-Oh! Over, and that's that pendulums were too strong out of the gate. Here's the deal. No, they weren't, and I can use evidence from tournaments to explain it. It's going to take a while because we have a couple years to cover, but here's what happened. When pendulums were first introduced, almost no one played them, and I really mean that. There was no tier 1 deck for the structure deck, or I mean the starter deck, I guess, as well as the first core set with pendulums. No deck played pendulums out there. The decks that were seen play were like Burning Abyss and Shaddolls and Stellar Knights. None of those decks have pendulums in them, and it wasn't until the next set where we even got a decent pendulum archetype, and that's Clifforts. And even though Clifforts were a top tier deck, they were one of the 3 best decks of the format. Here's the issue. The Cliffort strategy, while it technically does have to do with pendulum summon, they are pendulum monsters, it's not really a true pendulum deck. It doesn't really feel like many of the better pendulum decks that came out. The biggest reason being is that the Cliffort monsters restrict you from summoning anything but Cliffort monsters, and that really restricts what you can do. Because in general, when we're thinking of the good pendulum decks that we'll talk about throughout this video, they're summoning a variety of different archetype monsters. They're summoning a whole bunch of extra deck monsters because of their pendulum summoning. That's not really what Clifforts did. Clifforts, I mean, for all intents and purposes, were just a stun deck. They played triple Vanity's Emptiness. They played triple Skill Drain. They weren't really as we think of pendulum decks nowadays, and they weren't really what people were thinking of when pendulums were first announced either. So I just wanted to get that out of the way, that Clifforts were one of the better decks. They obviously were not the best deck, though. They're like the 3rd best deck, and they technically did have pendulums in there, but they weren't nearly as dominant as a lot of people might have thought the first big pendulum deck would be. And also, even if you take away the pendulum aspect of Clifforts, they don't intrinsically change too much. It definitely changes the strategy, but it doesn't completely take away what makes it good, because what made Clifforts good was the fact that they were good stun monsters, and Cliffort Scout could repeatedly search them to your hand. The fact that they were pendulum monsters mattered, but it didn't matter as much as later, better pendulum strategies in the future. And then, believe it or not, there wasn't another good, solid pendulum deck until over a year later. Really keep that in mind when you think that pendulums ruined Yu-Gi-Oh! Out of the gates. There was not an actual deck that took advantage of how pendulum summoning could be taken advantage of until over a year after the mechanic came out. If you go back to Synchros, if you go back to Xyz monsters, heck, if you go to link summoning, all of those mechanics almost immediately had a tier 1 deck out of the gates, fully abusing the mechanic, and it just got better and better and better with each new set. Pendulum summoning, this was not the case. There were certainly casual and rogue strategies that occasionally played pendulums, but for the most part, the latter half of 2014 and most of 2015, there was not a tier 1 pendulum deck other than Clifforts. We did not see a pendulum deck actually fully taking advantage of the mechanic until over a year later. So no, if you quit the game right when pendulums came out, pendulums didn't actually ruin the game like you might have thought they did, because people just weren't playing them. Most of the decks at the 2015 World Championships and WCQ were not playing pendulum monsters. Most decks were playing rituals or effect monsters or fusion monsters. It was actually a very diverse time in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, and pendulums were a part of that, but a very small part of that, and definitely not worth quitting the game over. So it wasn't until late 2015 when we finally got a true Pendulum deck as a tier 1 strategy, and that was Pendulum Magicians, and that deck was very good, don't get me wrong, but the thing about the tier 1 Pendulum Magician list, at least the early list before they got all of their crazy support in 2016 that we'll talk about in a second, those cards were good and it was a solid strategy, but you didn't have to play them. You weren't forced to play them. Unlike Link Monsters, which I think the biggest downside of them is that you're pretty much forced to play them in 2019, 2018. Pendulum Monsters, I mean, I don't think I've ever taken a Pendulum deck to a tournament, and I have gone to lots of tournaments over the last 5 years, and I don't think I've ever actually entered a tournament with Pendulum Monsters. I built one Pendulum deck at one point, but in general, you don't have to play Pendulum Monsters. There's only one time in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where you were pretty much forced to play Pendulum Monsters. It was early 2016, and that was when we got some of the craziest cards ever released to Yu-Gi-Oh! And yes, I think that is like the pinnacle of Pendulum sort of degeneracy. If you were one of the people that quit the game because of Pendulums and you were still paying attention to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Format, that probably would have been the set, that probably would have been the deck that you pointed to and said, haha, I was right, Pendulums did ruin the game. Here's the thing about that though, even though that Pepe deck was like the best deck and almost unbeatable and you had to play a deck at every single event, it only lasted like less than 3 weeks because Konami actually realized it was way too powerful, and then they just hit everything on the ban list. They actually had an emergency ban list to hit all of those cards, and that's not something we see very often. So Konami was acknowledging that that version of that Pendulum deck was way too good for the format, and then they hit a ton of the cards and banned a ton of the cards. It was a big deal for a lot of people, and then you were back to what happened like a couple months earlier. Yes, Pendulums were still a tier 1 strategy, but there were a variety of strategies that were out that you could play besides Pendulums. You had Monarchs and Cosmos and Burning Abyss and so many other things that didn't play Pendulums. So really when we're thinking of all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Since Pendulums were released, was there ever a format where you had to play just Pendulums? The answer is yes, and it's one time and it's for less than a month. Is that really worth quitting the game over? I think a lot of people really thought Pendulums would just be the best mechanic out of the gate, and certainly Pendulum Summoning, even before the Link Summon was added, was one of the best mechanics, and it is very good in the right strategy, but you've never really been forced to play the deck. If you didn't go to that one specific YCS that happened when that Pepe deck was at full power, you weren't really ever forced to play Pendulums, because right after it you could play so many other decks, and heck, the Monarch deck was like $30 for the whole thing, and it was a tier 1 deck. That's an excellent strategy for budget players and returning players to pick up and just enter event in. You don't have to play any Pendulums. You're not forced to do that, unlike Link Summoning, which we'll talk about in a future video. But in general, Pendulum Summoning did not make nearly as big of an impact as many players thought it would. If you quit the game because you thought Pendulums is just all that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is in 2018, 2019, I highly encourage you to come back because the mechanic did not have nearly as big of impact as a lot of people thought it did. Obviously, there were tier 1 Pendulum decks, and there were tier 1 Pendulum decks like a year after that as well, but when a mechanic takes 1 year to fully get to like a good strategy, and then that strategy gets instantly banned, is the mechanic truly good enough to actually quit the game over? I don't think so. And there certainly will be probably Pendulum player fans in the comment section below that are saying Pendulums have always been good. I mean, certainly there are even nowadays people that stand by Pendulums, and they are a pretty good rogue deck, but Pendulums aren't nearly as prevalent as a lot of people made them out to be, and most importantly, you don't have to play them. You never really have had to play them outside of that 1 month, and that's a big deal. And we even got perfect Pendulum counters like Dimensional Barrier. If you really hate Pendulums and you think you're going to go to a tournament and just play all rounds of Pendulums, just play Dimensional Barrier. Then you can probably win all those matchups. But the fact of the matter is that I think in the last like 10 tournaments I've gone to, I've played against maybe 2 players playing Pendulums. It's just not a very popular deck. It was pretty popular in early 2016, but by the end of the year, not a lot of people were actually playing Pendulums. They were moving on to things like Zodiacs, which was just Xyz monsters and just stuff like that. Anyway though, hopefully you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on this brief history of Pendulum Summoning. If you quit the game because of it, I highly encourage you to come back. You don't have to, but hopefully this gave you a better perspective on what actually happened when Pendulums were released. I'll see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.